The road we never expected. It was a chilly October evening when we decided to take a spontaneous road trip. The leaves had started to turn, painting the trees in fiery reds and oranges, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn. There were four of us: me, Claire, Jay, and Mark. Best friends since high school, we'd been through thick and thin together, and despite the craziness of adult life, we always made time for these little adventures. Claire had come up with the idea to visit an old abandoned amusement park 2 hours away. She was always the adventurous one, dragging the rest of us into her wild schemes. Jay, her boyfriend of 3 years, was her perfect counterpart. Calm, logical, but willing to go along with her ideas just to see her smile. Mark, my childhood friend, was the glue that held us together. He was the steady one, always looking out for everyone else. And then there was me, the storyteller of the group, the one who liked to capture everything in pictures and words. We piled into Mark's old SUV, joking about how it was held together with duct tape and prayers. The engine sputtered to life, and we were off, the GPS guiding us toward a night of adventure. The playlist alternated between upbeat road trip songs and hauntingly beautiful ballads that fit the season. We laughed, sang along, and shared stories, the miles slipping away unnoticed. As night fell, the road grew quieter. The highways turned into narrow country lanes, flanked by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. The excitement in the car dimmed slightly as the isolation sank in. We joked to keep the mood light, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. An hour away from our destination, we decided to stop at a roadside diner for some food. It was one of those old-fashioned places, complete with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. The waitress, a kind woman with a warm smile, served us steaming plates of burgers and fries. It felt comforting, like a pause in a story before the climax. Little did we know, the climax was waiting for us just beyond those neon diner lights. As we left the diner, the night seemed to press closer. The laughter and chatter that had filled the SUV earlier had quieted. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the road stretched ahead of us like a dark ribbon. Claire was scrolling through her phone, trying to find ghost stories about the amusement park we were heading to, while Jay navigated with the GPS. Mark, ever the responsible one, was driving, and I was in the back seat staring out the window. "Did you know the place is supposed to be haunted?" Claire said, her voice light but with an edge of mischief. Jay groaned. "Here we go." "No, I'm serious. There's this story about a ride that collapsed in the 80s. A bunch of people died, and they say you can still hear screams at night." "Thanks for that, Claire," Mark muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. "That's exactly what I needed to hear while driving us into the middle of nowhere." We all laughed, though the tension was palpable. Outside, the woods grew thicker, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The road became uneven, the cracks in the asphalt jarring us as Mark carefully navigated. The crash happened so fast that none of us had time to react. One moment, we were joking about haunted rides, and the next, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the middle of the road. It was a deer, frozen in place, its body illuminated by our headlights. Mark swerved instinctively, and the SUV skidded. The tires screamed against the pavement as the car spun, and for a brief second, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I remember the sound of metal crunching, the jolt as we hit something, a tree maybe, and then the suffocating silence that followed. When I opened my eyes, the car was tilted on its side. The windshield was shattered, and the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber. "Is everyone okay?" Mark's voice was shaky, but he was alert. Jay groaned, holding his arm. There was blood trickling down his forehead, but he nodded. Claire wasn't responding. She was slumped in her seat, her head resting at an odd angle. "Claire!" I screamed, scrambling to reach her. Mark had already unbuckled himself and climbed into the back. He gently tilted Claire's head, checking her pulse. "She's breathing," he said, relief flooding his voice. "We need to get help." I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely unlock the screen. There was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. Mark managed to pull Claire out of the wreckage while Jay and I stumbled after him. The SUV was totaled, leaning against a tree with steam hissing from the hood. Claire was unconscious, her breathing shallow. Jay's arm was definitely broken, and Mark had a nasty gash on his leg. I had a few scrapes, but adrenaline was keeping me upright. "We need to get to the hospital," Mark said, his voice firm despite the panic in his eyes. "Help me get her in the back." By some miracle, a pickup truck came down the road not long after. The driver, an older man with a grizzled beard and kind eyes, didn't ask many questions. He helped us load Claire into his truck and told us the nearest hospital was 30 minutes away. The drive felt like an eternity. Claire's breathing grew more labored, each shallow inhale like a dagger in my chest. I held her hand, whispering to her, begging her to hold on. Mark sat beside me, his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the seat. Jay was silent, his head leaning against the window, his own pain forgotten in the urgency of Claire's condition. "Stay with us, Claire," Mark kept muttering. "Just stay with us." But somewhere along that dark, winding road, Claire stopped breathing. The hospital staff tried everything. They worked on Claire for what felt like hours, but in the end, there was nothing they could do. The doctor came into the waiting room, his face a mask of sympathy, and delivered the words that shattered our world. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could." Mark broke down first. He collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into his hands. Jay sat frozen, staring at nothing, his broken arm forgotten. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Claire, our Claire, the heart of our group, was gone. The next few days were a blur of police reports, phone calls, and funeral arrangements. Claire's parents were devastated, her mother inconsolable as she clutched a picture of her daughter. Jay blamed himself, convinced he should have been paying more attention to the GPS. Mark spiraled into guilt, replaying the accident over and over in his mind. And me? I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. In the weeks that followed, the accident fractured us in ways we hadn't anticipated. Mark, who had always been the strong one, stopped answering calls. Jay ended his lease and moved back in with his parents, retreating into himself. I tried to keep us connected, organizing meetups and sending messages, but it was like trying to hold on to sand slipping through my fingers. One night, months after the accident, Mark finally opened up. "I can't stop seeing her face," he admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, she's there, and I keep thinking, if I'd just reacted a second faster." "It wasn't your fault," I said, though the words felt hollow. "It was an accident." "Was it?" His voice cracked. "Because it doesn't feel like one." Healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't even a line at all. More like a series of spirals, each one pulling us back to that night. But slowly, painfully, we started to find our footing again. Mark started therapy, confronting the guilt that had been eating away at him. Jay, with the help of Claire's parents, began volunteering at a local community center in her memory. I poured myself into writing, documenting everything about Claire. The way she laughed, the way she always made us try new things. It was my way of keeping her alive. On the 1-year anniversary of her death, we gathered at her favorite spot, a hill overlooking the city. We lit candles and shared stories, laughing through the tears as we remembered the girl who had brought so much light into our lives. Losing Claire changed us. It left scars that would never fully heal. But it also taught us the fragility of life and the importance of holding on to the people we love. Every time I get behind the wheel now, I think about that night. I think about the way everything can change in an instant. But most of all, I think about Claire, and I remind myself to live in a way that would make her proud. Because even though she's gone, her spirit is still with us, guiding us like a light on a dark road. It was a Friday night in mid-October, and the idea for a road trip came about like most of our plans. Half joking, half serious, and entirely Claire's doing. "You guys," she said, her blue eyes sparkling with mischief as she stood in the middle of my tiny apartment. "We never do anything spontaneous anymore. It's like we're old or something." "We're 24, Mark replied, not looking up from his phone. I think spontaneity peaked when we were 17. Exactly my point, Claire said, throwing a pillow at him. Come on, live a little. There's this place 2 hours from here, an abandoned amusement park. It's creepy, it's cool, and I heard it's great for pictures. Right up your alley, Olivia. She grinned at me. Jay sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. If we do this, are you promising not to make us break into anything? Because last time you almost got us arrested. Claire waved a hand dismissively. That was one time. 2 hours later, the four of us were crammed into Mark's old SUV, the smell of fast food mingling with the faint scent of air freshener that never quite masked the age of the car. The roads were relatively empty, the hum of the tires against the asphalt a comforting backdrop to our chatter. I leaned my head against the window, watching the moonlight filter through the trees as Claire talked animatedly about the history of the amusement park. They closed it in the 80s after some freak accidents, she said. There's this one ride called the Screamer. Apparently it used to go so fast that people blacked out. There's a rumor that— Let me guess, Jay interrupted. It's haunted. Claire smirked. Maybe. Mark groaned. Why do all your ideas involve ghosts or getting tetanus? Because boring is the worst kind of crime, Claire replied, tossing a fry at him. We never made it to the park. The deer came out of nowhere, its eyes glowing like tiny moons in the middle of the road. Mark slammed on the brakes, swerving instinctively. For a split second, the world seemed to tilt. The car skidded off the road, crashing through the underbrush before colliding with a tree. The impact knocked the breath out of me. My head slammed into the window, the sound of shattering glass ringing in my ears. When the car finally stopped, the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hiss of steam escaping the hood. Is everyone okay? Mark's voice cut through the haze. Jay groaned from the passenger seat, clutching his arm. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, but he was conscious. I looked to Claire, who was slumped in her seat, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Claire, I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for her, but my hands were shaking too much to be of any use. Mark climbed into the back to check her pulse. She's alive, he said, his voice tight. But we need to get her to a hospital. Now. The SUV was totaled. We had no choice but to flag down help. By some miracle, a pickup truck appeared a few minutes later. The driver, a middle-aged man named Hank, took one look at us and nodded. Get in, he said, his voice gruff but kind. We loaded Claire into the back seat, her head resting on my lap. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest more labored than the last. Jay sat beside me, cradling his broken arm, while Mark rode up front, directing Hank to the nearest hospital. Stay with us, Claire, I whispered, stroking her hair. We're almost there. But as the truck sped down the dark, winding road, I felt her body grow colder. The emergency room was chaos. Nurses and doctors swarmed as they rushed Claire onto a stretcher. We were left in the waiting room, huddled together in shock. Jay's arm was put in a sling and Mark's leg was bandaged, but none of it mattered compared to the weight hanging over us. An hour later, a doctor approached, his face solemn. I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We did everything we could, but she didn't make it. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Mark let out a guttural cry, sinking to his knees. Jay sat frozen, staring at the floor as tears streamed down his face. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My best friend, my sister in all but blood, was gone. Claire's funeral was held on a sunny day, the kind of day she would have loved. Her parents asked me to give a eulogy. I spent hours writing it, trying to capture her essence, but when the time came, I could barely get the words out. She was the bravest person I ever knew, I said, my voice breaking. She wasn't afraid to live, to take risks, to drag us along on her crazy adventures. She made life brighter just by being in it. And now, it's hard to imagine a world without her. The weeks that followed were a blur. Mark blamed himself, replaying the accident in his head. Jay withdrew completely, refusing to talk to anyone. And me? I tried to keep us together, but the cracks in our friendship were too deep. One night, Mark showed up at my apartment, his eyes bloodshot. "I can't stop seeing her," he said, his voice raw. "Every time I close my eyes, she's there. And I keep thinking, if I had just braked a second earlier." "It wasn't your fault," I said, though the words felt meaningless. It took months for any of us to start healing. Mark started therapy, slowly working through his guilt. Jay began volunteering at a local youth center in Claire's memory. I started writing, journals filled with memories of Claire, stories of her adventures, and letters I wished I could send her. On the 1-year anniversary of her death, we met at her favorite spot, a hill overlooking the city. We lit candles and shared stories, laughing through the tears. For the first time in months, it felt like she was with us again. Claire's death changed us forever. It taught us the fragility of life, the importance of holding on to the people we love, and the strength it takes to move forward. Even now, years later, I carry her memory with me. Every time I take a risk, every time I laugh too loud or chase a dream, I feel her spirit beside me, urging me to live fully. Because that's what she would have wanted. Life didn't return to normal after Claire's death. It just shifted into something unrecognizable. Grief doesn't announce itself like a storm. It seeps into the cracks, quiet and relentless, turning the mundane into a battlefield. For weeks, my apartment was eerily silent. Claire's absence was loudest in the spaces she used to fill. The empty seat at the diner, the unanswered group chats, the weekends that stretched too long without her endless schemes. Mark, Jay, and I tried to reconnect, but every conversation circled back to the accident, a gaping wound none of us knew how to close. Mark stopped driving altogether. The SUV sat in his parents' driveway, its crumpled frame a stark reminder of that night. He couldn't bring himself to sell it or even look at it. "It feels like letting her go," he admitted once, his voice barely above a whisper. Jay's silence was worse. He stopped coming to our meetups, stopped replying to texts. The guilt had taken root in him, festering in ways we couldn't reach. Claire had been his partner, his anchor, and without her, he seemed lost at sea. 2 months after the funeral, Mark showed up at my apartment unannounced. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled. "I can't do this anymore," he said as he sank onto my couch. I made tea, even though neither of us drank it. "Talk to me," I said, sitting beside him. He stared at the floor. "It's my fault she's dead. I was the one driving. I swerved too hard. If I'd just—" "No," I interrupted, gripping his hand. "Don't do this to yourself. There was a deer in the road, Mark. You did the best you could." "But it wasn't enough," he said, his voice cracking. "She's gone, Liv, and nothing I do will ever bring her back." We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I said, "You're right, she's gone. But Claire wouldn't want you to destroy yourself over this. You were her rock, Mark, the one who always kept us safe. She'd hate to see you like this." It was the first time I saw him cry, his shoulders shaking as he finally let himself grieve. While Mark slowly began to confront his pain, Jay withdrew further. He quit his job and moved back in with his parents. When I finally tracked him down, it took an hour of coaxing before he let me in. His room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. On his desk was a framed photo of him and Claire, taken during a trip to the beach the summer before. He was smiling, holding her close as she laughed at something just out of frame. "I should have been the one driving," he said, his voice hollow. "Maybe then—" "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to do this, Jay. You don't get to rewrite history. You loved her. You did everything you could for her." "I wasn't there for her when it mattered," he whispered. "She died, Liv. She died because we were chasing some stupid thrill. That wasn't your fault. That was Claire's spirit. She lived for those moments, and she wouldn't want you to waste the life you still have." It wasn't a single moment that changed things, but a series of small, deliberate steps. Mark started seeing a therapist, someone who helped him untangle the knots of guilt he carried. Jay found solace in volunteering, working with kids at a community center. Claire always believed in helping people, he told me one day. This, this feels like a way to honor her. As for me, I began writing, a journal filled with memories of Claire. I wrote about her fearless laugh, the way she always wore mismatched socks, the countless times she pulled us out of our comfort zones. I wrote letters to her, telling her about the world she'd left behind, about how much we missed her. On the first anniversary of Claire's death, we decided to honor her memory. The three of us drove to her favorite spot, a hill overlooking the city where she used to bring us for stargazing. It was the first time we'd all been together in months. We brought candles, photos, and a bottle of Claire's favorite wine. Sitting under the stars, we shared stories, laughing and crying as we remembered her. Mark held up his glass. "To Claire," he said, "for teaching us how to live." "To Claire," Jay and I echoed, our voices trembling. Life didn't go back to the way it was before. It couldn't. But it found a new rhythm, one that carried Claire's memory with us. Mark started driving again, slowly reclaiming the freedom he'd lost. Jay went back to school, studying social work to help others the way he wished he could have helped Claire. And me? I published a book, a collection of essays and poems inspired by her. We weren't the same people we'd been before the accident, but we weren't broken anymore. We were stronger, more aware of life's fragility, and more determined to live fully. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Claire's voice, teasing me about being too cautious or urging me to take a leap of faith. And in those moments, I smile, because I know she's still with me, in the risks I take, the adventures I embrace, and the love I carry for the people around me. Life goes on, but so does her legacy. And as long as we remember her, Claire will never truly be gone.